What if I told you there was a moment in American history when capitalism didn't just feel unfair, it felt dangerous? A moment when the richest country on earth stood on a knife's edge, growing wealthier by the day, yet somehow becoming more unstable, more unequal, and more controlled by a handful of men than at any time before or since. A moment when the economy wasn't simply imbalanced, it was combustible, shaped by private empires so large they overshadowed the nation itself. Most people today think America has always looked the way it does now. But there was a time when the system nearly tore itself apart, and a time when people believed the government could do nothing to stop it. Yet that same crisis pushed the country to do something unthinkable, rebuild capitalism from the ground up before capitalism destroyed the country that created it. Welcome to a story of power, wealth, rebellion, and the moment America stood at the edge of collapse and decided to fight back.
Demand change now. The people will not be ignored.
To understand how close America came to breaking, you have to step back into a world that looked nothing like the one we know today. The late 1800s were an age of unstoppable growth and almost no rules. Railroads were carving new arteries across the continent. Steel was rising into cities like a new religion. Oil was becoming the lifeblood of the modern world. Finance was the engine feeding every boom. On the surface, it looked like progress. Underneath, it was something else entirely. Private empires were forming, empires so vast, so wealthy, so deeply wired into the economy that they overshadowed the national government itself. John D. Rockefeller didn't just supply oil, he decided who got to sell it and what they paid. J.P. Morgan didn't just run a bank, he could move markets with a whisper. Andrew Carnegie, J. Gould, and others built industries where competition wasn't conquered, it was erased. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans lived a reality that feels almost dystopian today. 14-hour shifts, no safety rules, children crawling through mines, accidents so common that death became a line item in accounting books. If you were injured, you were replaced. If you complained, they sent armed men to silence you. And through it all, the political system, the system meant to protect the public, had been swallowed by the very titans it was supposed to restrain. Senators were bought like assets. Newspapers were tamed by corporate money. Courts sided with the companies whose power they were meant to check. Democracy wasn't dead, but it was compromised so deeply that many Americans believed the country itself had become the property of the wealthy. Then came the financial collapses. 1873, 1893, two historic panics that shattered banks, destroyed businesses, and sent millions spiraling into unemployment. It wasn't just economic stress. It was a warning, a signal that the United States was drifting toward a breaking point, a system that was producing unimaginable wealth and, at the same time, suffering from unimaginable instability. But the real twist, the one history rarely emphasizes, is this: the Gilded Age didn't end because it collapsed. It ended because Americans decided to confront it. And what happened next would reshape the country, redraw the rules of capitalism, and create a blueprint for reform that today's world may need more than ever. By the late 1800s, America wasn't just growing. It was accelerating at a speed the world had never seen before. Cities shot upward. Railroads stretched across deserts and mountains like iron veins. Factories consumed entire neighborhoods with noise, smoke, and fire. But the real story wasn't the growth itself. It was who controlled it. Because this wasn't simply an economy. It was a kingdom. And its kings were men whose power dwarfed anything held by elected officials. John D. Rockefeller held more control over oil than some governments held over their own militaries. At his peak, he influenced the price of lighting the world. J.P. Morgan didn't just manage capital, he commanded it. He could stabilize markets, crush competitors, or rescue entire industries with a single conversation. Andrew Carnegie built steel empires that shaped the skeleton of the American city. Jay Gould bent railroads to his will and destabilized markets for profit in ways that could topple entire regions. These men didn't compete with each other. They carved out entire sectors like private kingdoms, dictating prices, policies, and even political decisions from the back rooms of luxury hotels and private train cars. The government, theoretically sovereign, often found itself reduced to a spectator or worse, a servant. But while the titans rose upward, the workers who fueled this new prosperity lived lives that were brutal, precarious, and short. 12-hour days blurred into 14. Steel workers labored beside molten metal where one wrong step meant instant death. Miners inhaled dust that slowly killed them long before they reached old age. Children, some as young as 8, were sent into factories and mines not because their parents wanted it, but because survival demanded it. There were no safety rules, no compensation if you were hurt, no contracts, no pension, no protection. A worker was a tool, cheap, replaceable, and expendable. And if those workers dared to organize, if they dared to question the system, the response was swift and violent. Corporations hired private armies. Detectives shot strikers. Governors deployed militias. Federal troops broke picket lines with bayonets drawn and rifles primed. Every part of the system, economic, political, legal, tilted toward the powerful. But even that wasn't the full picture. Because behind the wealth and the suffering, behind the skyscrapers and coal dust, something else was happening. The American economy was becoming too big, too interconnected, and too dependent on private empires to keep itself stable. And soon, the cracks would begin to show. Cracks that started small and then ripped through the entire financial system. Cracks that would prove that a country cannot rely on a handful of men to steer the entire economy, not without consequences. For a while, the Titans looked invincible. Rockefeller controlled oil, Morgan controlled finance, Carnegie controlled steel, and the government, overwhelmed and underfunded, seemed unable or unwilling to challenge any of them. But power like that is never stable, not forever. Not when an entire nation depends on a handful of men pulling invisible levers behind closed doors. The first signs of collapse didn't come from politics. They came from the markets. In 1873, it started with a banking firm failing, a single spark, and suddenly the entire financial system went dark. Railroads froze, banks imploded, businesses collapsed overnight, factories shut down, unemployment soared so fast that there weren't even numbers for it. People filled the streets in desperation, cities broke under the strain, families starved, workers rioted, the country convulsed. And yet, the lesson went unlearned. 20 years later, in 1893, it happened again. But this time the dominoes fell faster. Hundreds of banks evaporated, thousands of businesses vaporized in weeks, millions found themselves without jobs, without savings, without hope. These weren't ordinary recessions. They were ruptures, a warning that the American economy wasn't just unfair, it was fragile, too centralized, too unregulated, too dependent on a financial elite whose power could, intentionally or not, steer the entire system into the ground. And for ordinary Americans, the consequences were brutal. Factory workers who had endured 14-hour days were now thrown onto the streets with nothing. Miners who risked their lives underground found their wages cut, their jobs gone, their families starving. Railroad workers who powered the nation saw their pay slashed while executives escaped untouched. Desperation boiled over. In 1877, workers across multiple railroads rose up in the Great Strike, a wave of unrest that spread like wildfire from Baltimore to Pittsburgh to Chicago to St. Louis. Rail depots burned, militias fired, bodies fell, cities trembled. The message was unmistakable. A system that enriches a few while destabilizing millions cannot survive forever. But for the men at the top, the unrest wasn't a warning, it was an inconvenience. Executives blamed workers. Newspapers blamed agitators. Politicians blamed lawlessness, and the courts, predictably, ruled in favor of the corporations every single time. The people were suffering, the system was breaking, and the elites insisted nothing was wrong, but something was terribly wrong, something fundamental. An economy controlled by private empires had created a country drowning in instability, and the cracks were widening fast. But the most surprising part of this story is not the suffering, nor the corruption, nor the collapse. It's what happened next. Because instead of breaking under the weight of inequality and crisis, America did something extraordinary. It fought back. By the late 1800s, America was a country stretched to its breaking point. The rich were untouchable, the poor were expendable, and the economy, the very engine of national pride, kept collapsing under the weight of its own inequality. Most nations, when cornered like this, fracture. They collapse. They fall into revolution or dictatorship or ruin. But America took a different path, a strange, improbable, unlikely path. It began with voices, not powerful ones, not wealthy ones, but voices that refused to stay silent. Journalists, reformers, lawyers, teachers, union leaders, ordinary citizens who had simply had enough. They didn't have money. They didn't have influence. They didn't have political machines, but they had something else, information, the truth. And they were ready to reveal it. Magazines and newspapers started publishing stories that exposed the machinery of the Gilded Age in brutal, unfiltered detail. Ida Tarbell dismantled Rockefeller's empire not with force, but with facts, revealing Standard Oil's secret deals, its predatory tactics, its ability to crush competitors without ever touching them. Next, Upton Sinclair infiltrated the meatpacking plants and returned with something that shocked the nation, a world of filth, danger, corruption, and human suffering hidden in plain sight. Journalists peeled back the curtain, and what Americans saw wasn't just unfairness, it was rot. A system built on exploitation and protected by institutions that were supposed to safeguard the public. And once the truth was revealed, public opinion shifted, slowly at first, then with the force of a tidal wave. People realized something essential. The economy wasn't just failing them. It was betraying them. The monopolies weren't symbols of progress. They were barriers, threats. Thriving kingdoms built on the backs of workers who had nothing, not safety, not rights, not representation. And slowly, a simple idea took hold. If the government belonged to the people, then the people could demand rules, real rules, enforceable rules, rules that applied to the titans as much as they applied to everyone else. The first crack appeared in 1890 with the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law that, in theory, made monopolies illegal. Was it perfect? No. Courts were hostile, corporations were slippery, politicians were compromised, but its existence mattered. It signaled something new. The era of untouchable private empires was no longer inevitable. America was discovering its voice, its anger, its courage. The country's political imagination was waking up. The belief that reform was impossible was beginning to crumble. And that shift, that moral and political awakening, set the stage for a figure who would change everything. A president who understood that breaking the Gilded Age required not just laws, but leadership. A leader who would confront corporate power with the full force of the presidency itself. And his arrival would turn the entire system upside down. By the turn of the 20th century, America was awake. The journalists had exposed the rot. Workers had suffered the consequences. Citizens had seen the truth behind the curtain. But seeing the problem and confronting the problem are two very different things. What the country needed now was not just outrage. It needed a champion, a leader willing to challenge the titans on their own battlefield. And in 1901, that leader arrived in the form of a man with boundless energy, an explosive personality, and a belief that the presidency was not a ceremonial office, but a weapon, Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt didn't tiptoe into the presidency. He stormed into it. Young, fiery, relentless. He believed that the government existed not to obey the wealthy, but to restrain them. To Roosevelt, the problem wasn't big business itself. The problem was business so big it could challenge the authority of the republic. And so he went after the most powerful corporate empire in America, the Northern Securities Company, a colossal railroad monopoly controlled by J.P. Morgan, Edward Harriman, and James Hill, men whose wealth and influence had terrified politicians for decades. When Roosevelt filed suit against them, people didn't believe it would matter. Morgan himself reportedly told Roosevelt, "Send your man to my office and we'll fix it." But Roosevelt didn't want a deal. He wanted a fight. He wanted the country to see that monopolies were not inevitable, that private empires were not eternal, that the rule of law applied to everyone, even the richest men in America. And against all expectations, Roosevelt won. The Supreme Court sided with him. Northern Securities was dismantled. A message echoed across the country: the age of untouchable industrial kings was ending. Roosevelt didn't stop there. He strengthened railroad regulations, fought for consumer protections, and backed reforms that curbed corporate abuse without destroying legitimate enterprise. He redefined the presidency, turning it into a force capable of standing up to concentrated private power. And for the first time in decades, ordinary Americans saw something they hadn't seen in generations: a government that could fight for them. But even Roosevelt, with all his force and vision, could not prevent the next moment of crisis, a moment that would expose a deeper flaw in the American financial system. Because no matter how many laws Roosevelt passed, no matter how many monopolies he challenged, the nation was still dangerously dependent on a handful of private bankers to bail it out in times of panic. And when the next crisis struck, the fragility of the system would be revealed in one shocking moment, a moment that would force America to rethink who should control the lifeblood of the economy. For all of Roosevelt's victories, for all the antitrust lawsuits, for all the public pressure and political courage, there was still one part of the American system that remained dangerously untouched: finance. Because in the early 1900s, the United States had no central bank, no institution that could stabilize markets, no federal backstop when panic struck, no emergency lender capable of holding the nation together. Instead, America relied, whether it admitted it or not, on the sheer personal influence of one man, J.P. Morgan, a titan so powerful that his phone call could calm Wall Street or send it into hysteria. And in 1907, the full danger of that system revealed itself. It began with a failed attempt to corner the copper market. A small group of speculators lost big, but their failure triggered something far worse. Rumors spread, banks faltered, depositors panicked, lines formed outside financial institutions as people begged to pull out their savings. Within days, New York was drowning in fear. The entire banking system was on the verge of collapse, and the U.S. government could do almost nothing. The Treasury was too weak, Congress was too divided, federal tools were too limited, so the country turned to an unelected private citizen, a man who had no official position, no public mandate, no accountability beyond his own conscience: J.P. Morgan. At 70 years old, with a massive nose, piercing eyes, and a presence that intimidated even presidents, Morgan stepped into the crisis as if he had been waiting for it. He summoned the nation's top bankers to his private library, a room lined with mahogany, dominated by a single green reading lamp. Once everyone arrived, Morgan did something unthinkable. He locked the doors. No one would leave until they agreed on a rescue plan to save the American financial system. For hours, the bankers argued, hesitated, begged, and resisted. But Morgan didn't negotiate. He commanded. He assigned blame, allocated losses, forced mergers, and dictated terms. At one point, when a group of bankers tried to slip out early, Morgan simply blocked the exit with his massive frame. They were not leaving until they signed. By dawn, Morgan had engineered a private sector bailout of the entire U.S. economy, and it worked. Markets stabilized. Banks reopened. The panic receded. J.P. Morgan, a single man, had saved the nation because the government could not. But once the crisis was over, America felt something more disturbing than relief. It had just witnessed what it meant to rely on a financier instead of a federal system. If J.P. Morgan had refused, if he had failed, if he had chosen profit over rescue, the country would have plunged into an economic abyss. This terrifying truth became impossible to ignore. No democracy should depend on one private banker to prevent national collapse. And so, the Panic of 1907 did something that no previous crisis had accomplished. It convinced the United States that the financial system needed a backbone, a real one, not a titan, not a bank dynasty, not a private savior, but a central bank. A public institution designed to stabilize the economy so that no future panic would require Morgan or anyone else to lock bankers in a library and rescue the country by force of personality. And in 1913, that realization became reality. The United States created the Federal Reserve, not as a financial experiment, but as a direct response to the danger revealed in 1907, the danger of leaving the fate of an entire nation in the hands of one man. The Panic of 1907 left a scar on the American psyche, not just because the financial system nearly collapsed, but because the country finally realized something undeniable. If a nation depends on one wealthy man to save it, the nation is not in control of its own future. The creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 was the first major step in reclaiming that control. But it wouldn't be the last, because America was beginning to understand a painful truth about capitalism. It does not correct itself. It does not restrain its excesses. It does not protect the vulnerable on its own. Left unchecked, it pulls toward consolidation, toward exploitation, toward instability, just as it had in the Gilded Age. So after creating the Fed, the country pushed further, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. The reform movement that had begun with antitrust and gained a champion in Theodore Roosevelt now spread across the political landscape. And for the first time in decades, ordinary people saw solutions emerging from a system that had once ignored them. Child labor laws began to take shape. The idea that children belonged in school, not factories or mines, was no longer radical. It was becoming national consensus. Workplace safety standards emerged. Companies could no longer hide behind injury waivers and disposable workers. States developed workers' compensation programs so that a lost limb wouldn't mean a lost family. The 8-hour day, once dismissed as a fantasy, became a legitimate demand, a rallying cry for unions, a symbol that labor too deserved dignity. And perhaps most importantly, with the ratification of the 16th Amendment and the creation of the federal income tax, the government finally gained the ability to challenge the sheer scale of oligarchic wealth. For the first time, private fortunes were not untouchable. The state had the resources to build public institutions, to enforce regulations, to rein in monopolies, and to act as a counterweight to the titans who had once ruled unchecked. This wasn't about destroying capitalism. It was about disciplining it, reshaping it into something that could support a middle class, protect workers, and maintain national stability. And incredibly, for a moment, it worked. America had managed to transform a system that once threatened its democracy into one that could sustain prosperity for millions. But the story doesn't end here, because the very guardrails that saved the system would not remain forever. Over time, they would be weakened, challenged, dismantled. Not overnight, not with one law, but slowly, through ideology, through influence, through the political winds of a new era. What America built in the wake of the first Gilded Age would eventually be undone, piece by piece, and a new Gilded Age would rise in its place. For a generation, the reforms of the progressive era held the system together. Child labor declined, workplace safety improved, monopolies were challenged, wages rose, a middle class began to form, and for the first time, capitalism served not just the wealthy, but the many. But history has a quiet, relentless gravity, and the protections that defend ordinary people rarely vanish in one blow. They erode, slowly, invisibly, through ideas, through influence, through the steady drip of political pressure. By the mid-20th century, the memory of the Gilded Age was fading. People had grown comfortable. Prosperity felt normal, even inevitable. And whenever a society feels safe, someone always whispers the oldest myth in capitalism. Markets don't need rules. Markets regulate themselves. It sounds modern, but it's the same story America heard in the 1890s. The same story that produced monopolies, exploitation, and financial collapse. But this time, the myth didn't return as a whisper. It returned as an ideology. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, a new economic faith took hold. One that saw regulation as a burden, antitrust as outdated, unions as obstacles, and taxation of the wealthy as both immoral and inefficient. Step by step, law by law, administration by administration, the guardrails were quietly removed. Financial markets were deregulated, opening the door for speculation on a scale no one had seen before. Corporate mergers accelerated, allowing companies to grow so massive they resembled the trusts of the Gilded Age. Tax rates at the top plummeted, letting fortunes compound faster than at any point since the days of Rockefeller and Morgan. Unions were weakened, not through one battle, but through 1,000 small ones waged across states, courts, and workplaces. Campaign finance laws loosened, allowing money to flood deeper into politics than even the old political machines could have imagined. Manufacturing jobs were automated or offshored. Labor protections were chipped away. Workers' bargaining power collapsed. None of this happened overnight. It happened slowly, through think tanks, lobbyists, corporate campaigns, and a political narrative that painted private profit as identical to public good. Reform didn't fail. Reform was unbuilt. The system didn't break. It was rearranged. And the consequences would soon become impossible to ignore, because when the guardrails came down, inequality returned. Not quietly, not gradually, but with a force that echoed the first Gilded Age. When the guardrails finally came down, inequality didn't return quietly. It roared back, not as a shadow of the old Gilded Age, but as a sharper, faster, more global version of it. A second Gilded Age, wearing modern clothes. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. The top 1% of Americans now holds nearly 40% of the nation's wealth, one of the highest concentrations of wealth in the entire developed world. The bottom half of the country, roughly 165 million people, holds just 2 to 3%. And the elite of the elite, the top 0.01%, barely a few thousand families, command a share of national wealth on par with the oligarchs of the 1890s. In 2023 alone, 19 of America's wealthiest households added around $1 trillion to their combined net worth. A trillion added to fewer than 20 families in a single year. If those numbers feel like something out of the 19th century, it's because they are. The architecture of inequality that reformers once dismantled has been rebuilt. Taller, sleeker, more fortified, and far more insulated from democratic pressure. But inequality isn't the only echo of the past. Labor, too, carries the old scars. The Gilded Age was a world of dangerous jobs, no safety net, and children working in factories and mines. Today, children aren't crawling into coal shafts, but the pressures feel eerily familiar. Wages have barely moved in decades. Housing costs have skyrocketed. Healthcare bankrupts families. Millions drift between gig jobs, temporary work, and unstable employment with no benefits and no protections. And in some states, shockingly, lawmakers have begun rolling back child labor protections, allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to work longer hours, later nights with fewer safeguards. A century ago, reformers fought to pull children out of dangerous workplaces. Today, some states are quietly opening the door for them to return. It's not the same industries, it's not the same language, but it is the same pressure. Because when an economic system is stretched thin, the first protections to be sacrificed are always the ones meant for the most vulnerable. Meanwhile, corporate power has reorganized itself into forms the original progressives could never have imagined. Standard Oil has become big tech. U.S. Steel has become global private equity. The railroad trusts have become digital platforms that control supply chains, advertising markets, retail ecosystems, data flows, the very infrastructure of modern life. The monopolies of the Gilded Age controlled transportation and oil. The monopolies of today control information itself. And just like 120 years ago, the political system often struggles to restrain them, not because the laws don't exist, but because enforcement has weakened, lobbying has deepened, and the belief that the market knows best has crept back into the bloodstream of both major political parties. We aren't watching history repeat. We're watching it rhyme with algorithms, global capital, and corporate empires that answer to no nation. America has entered another moment of staggering wealth concentration, fragile labor conditions, political capture, and rising public frustration. A second Gilded Age, different in form, identical in function. But if this is where the story ended, it would be hopeless. And history is never that simple. So after all the booms and busts, after the rise of private empires, after the crashes, the corruption, the reforms, the rebuilding, the erosion, and the return of inequality, what does this story really tell us? Not that capitalism is broken, not that democracy is doomed, not that history is a loop we are trapped inside. It tells us something far more powerful. The rules of the economy are not fixed. They are written by people. And what people write, people can rewrite. A century ago, America stood at the edge. Inequality was suffocating the country. Workers were breaking under the weight of an unforgiving system. Monopolies distorted every part of daily life. Politics bowed to private wealth. And yet, the country did not fall, because ordinary people refused to let it. They exposed abuses. They pressured lawmakers. They rebuilt institutions. They demanded fairness. They forced the system to serve the public instead of the powerful. They rebalanced capitalism without destroying it. They saved the country by redesigning the rules it lived under. Today, the similarities are unmistakable. Inequality is rising. Corporate empires are expanding. Labor is under pressure. The political system is strained, and frustration is building. But if the Gilded Age taught us anything, it's that these pressures are not a prophecy of collapse. They are a signal, a sign that reform is not only possible, but necessary. The truth is simple, and it cuts through every headline and every debate. Extreme inequality is not sustainable, and societies eventually correct it, one way or another. The question is never whether the pendulum swings. The question is how. Do we fix the system through structure and reform? Through pressure and participation? Through laws, institutions, and democratic will? Or do we wait until imbalanced forces change in ways no one can control? History has shown both paths, and it has shown the cost of delay. But it has also shown hope. Because the last time inequality looked like this, America didn't collapse. It transformed. It chose to rewrite the rules. It chose to discipline private power. It chose to build protections for workers, families, and the future. It chose to make capitalism serve the public instead of the other way around. That wasn't destiny. That wasn't luck. That was courage. And the same courage exists today, waiting, quiet, gathering strength. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with intention. And the last time the nation stood at a moment like this, the people didn't break. They fought back. They reimagined the system. They reshaped the future. That's not nostalgia. That's precedent. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.